So I don't know if I completely finished the section on grain offerings, so let me just go to the next slide here. We were in Leviticus 2 talking about grain or cereal offerings and talked about what was required there, the finest wheat, olive oil, usually frankincense, at least when it was offered, the grain offering was offered in its raw form. And of course, there always had to be salt. Remember that? Because salt is symbolic of what? Purification, right? Or preservation as well. Yeah. It symbolizes God's holy, faithful commitment to his covenant. And I think the kind of holy, faithful commitment he desires from his people, right? And so there always had to be the salt of the covenant added to the offering. Now, there were a couple things that weren't to be added to the offering. One of them was to the grain offering, something you couldn't put in the grain offering. Honey, right? And yeast, both of which we talked about involve fermentation, decay. And so they're kind of like the anti the anti-salt, right? They're the products, or in the case of honey, the product of fermentation, or in the case of yeast, an agent of fermentation, right? They're seen as impurities, as additives, whereas salt is a preservative, keeping that which is pure intact. So there's symbolism tied up here in the offering. Okay. Now, as for the offering itself, just briefly, the offerer would bring his or her grain offering to the tabernacle, present it to the priest. The priest would take a token portion of it. If there were incense, frankincense involved, that whole portion with the incense would go on the altar, make this pleasing aroma to God. And then the rest of the grain offering would belong to the officiating priest for his consumption, the consumption of his family. Okay, this is a way of providing for the needs of those who served in the house of God. Next slide. So what do we learn about what can we learn about our worship from this kind of offering? What's its relevance for us today? Well, a couple of quick thoughts. The word for the grain offering, the mincha, is the word elsewhere used in the Bible for like a tribute, when you're presenting a tribute, a gift to a king, all right? So think of the grain offering in that way. And think of our worship in that way as well. When we gather on Sunday mornings and we bring together our gifts, our thanksgiving, our hearts overflowing with praise, we are offering a tribute to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. We want that to be our best, right? And what we offer up to the Lord is a memorial, kind of like the memorial portion offered up on the altar. It's a reminder of God's covenant. Reminds us of his covenant, and reminds, in a sense, God of his covenant, right? Not that God needs reminding, but it's calling upon him to act in faithfulness to all of his promises. And so it embodies that covenant aspect of our relationship with God. Something else to think about in regards to the grain offering. Usually, with the exception of the first fruits, which you roast the heads of grain, it involved flour, right? Finely ground flour with all the bran separated out, okay? And this, I think, maybe suggests to us that there's an aspect of labor to worship, that the labor of our hands constitutes part of our sacred obligation to God, right? It took effort to make those wafers, those cakes, to grind that flour. You know, they didn't go down to the store and just pull a sack of golden metal, whatever that brand is, off the or Pillsbury off the shelf, right? That was a lot of, you know. I imagine some of the women in ancient Israel looked like Rosie the Riveter. They probably from grinding all that meal, right? Yeah. You ever think of your labor to God as part of your worship? I think you should, right? If it's part of that living sacrifice that we place before God. And lastly, there's a little section at the end of that chapter about the first fruits grain offering. So at the barley harvest and the wheat harvest and so forth, the Israelites were required to take a first portion of their crop, place it before the Lord, okay, as a way of saying, thank you, God, for providing for my needs, for remembering us, and as a way also of saying, God, I'm going to trust you to bring about the full harvest. So you devote that first portion to God. And I think that's a principle that still applies to our worship. God desires the first fruits of our attention, of our hearts, of our offerings, not our leftovers. And I think so many times we're tempted to treat God as an afterthought and spend what we want on ourselves, and if we have time, we'll do the church thing. If we've got anything left over, we'll put it in the offering plate, whatever. Yeah. Very early. Yeah. 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 Not even at the end of harvest. It's right at the beginning, the first fruits. And the the month when the barley began to bud, I guess, was called the month of Abib. And Abib is the Hebrew word for like those milky, not even completely ripe kernels of grain. Okay? We'll talk more about the first fruits and their offerings when we get to Leviticus 23, because there's a lot of significance when we think about Christ as the first fruits. Okay? Any questions before we proceed? All right. Moving on to Leviticus chapter 3 and the third major type of offering, fellowship offerings, maybe better translated fellowship sacrifices. The Hebrew is zavak shalamim. Zavak is the word for a sacrifice. And we actually haven't seen this word for sacrifice yet, which is interesting. But in very ancient times, that word zavak had reference to a sacrificial meal. Okay, think about when Samuel would sometimes go to different places and hold a sacrifice. It would be like a big dinner party, right? Well, the zevach was originally a ritual meal. And then later that word was used to other kinds of sacrifices. Here I think it's used in that ancient sense of ritual meal. The word shalamim, you might hear the Hebrew shalom there. That's why this expression is sometimes translated as a peace offering, a shalom offering, or a well-being. Shalom has the idea of wholeness about it, okay? I like to think of this as a fellowship offering, a fellowship sacrifice, because what this sacrifice really does is it provides an occasion for community, for families, for worshipers to get together and have a meal, not only among themselves, but with God as the honored guest. Look at the next slide. Think of it as a shared meal, a sacred potluck. And you've got three parties involved here. You've got the Lord, you've got the priests, and you've got the offerer and his or her family, okay? So here's a quote from one of the scholars I've been reading. Next slide. This comes from Baruch Levine's commentary on Leviticus. He says the purpose of this sacrifice was, quote, to afford the worshipers the experience of joining together with the priests in a sacred meal at which God himself was perceived to be the honored guest. And that was a rare privilege. Prior to these laws in Leviticus, where do we see people having a meal with God? Well, I think of one example in Exodus chapter 24, where I think it was Aaron and his sons, Moses, and some of the elders of Israel went up on the mountain and ate and drank in the presence of God. Remember that? Well, remember how the tabernacle is kind of like a portable Sinai, right? There's going to be this ongoing communion between God and his people, and one of the most important ways to express communion is having a meal together. I mean, we know that as Christians, right? Anytime we get together, we love to have food. It's a social lubricant. It frees us up, right, to share and our life together. And here Israel is sharing the bounty of life together with God. Okay, so it's a beautiful thing. So let's learn more about this beautiful sacrifice. Unless you have a question or comment before we move forward. All right, next slide then. Okay, so this kind of sacrifice, this fellowship offering, we'll call it, could be used for different purposes. Some of which are listed there in Leviticus chapter 7. They were used as a way of giving thanks to God. Oftentimes in the Psalms, you'll read these prayers where the psalmist is in dire straits. Not the band from the 80s, but like, in a place of just like hovering near death. And the psalmist will cry out to God and say, God, if you get me out of this jam, I will come before you with thanksgiving. I'll offer sacrifices. I'll declare your name before the congregation, okay? So the fellowship offering would have been that thank offering, okay? A way of celebrating with everyone what God had done for the petitioner, okay? So it's a means of giving thanks to God. Fellowship offerings were also used to seal a vow with God, to dedicate oneself to God in fulfillment of a vow, okay? Sometimes they're called votive offerings for that reason, okay? And they could also just be a spontaneous expression of praise or desire for fellowship with God. And so a free will offering is also a form of the fellowship offering, okay? These are different kind of sub-purposes of purposes that the fellowship offering played, okay? And there are some differences between these types of fellowship offerings, which we'll get to later, but they're kind of subtle, all right? Okay? So basically, these are not, for the most part, they're not mandatory sacrifices. It's not like you've sinned or become, seriously ritually impure in some way and you need expiation for that. That's not what's going on here, okay? Sometimes people hear this referred to as a peace offering, and they think, oh, then the worshiper must have done something to offend God, and they've got to make peace with God. That's not the idea, okay? The idea is that you already are at peace with God, and you want to celebrate that, okay? Is that clear? All right, so let's move on to the next slide. All right, what was on the menu? Got to talk about what was on the menu. Well, there are three kinds of animals that one could offer, I guess depending on what you could afford, right? You could offer up a cow, male or female. Okay, so there's it's not just the male that has to be offered. It could be either male or female from the herd or from the flock, a goat or a sheep. I don't read anywhere about pigeons being offered up as fellowship offerings, but there's not a whole lot of meat on a pigeon. Have you ever killed a dove and tried to eat a dove? Yeah. You won't feed a whole family with a Cornish hen, right? Exactly. And the idea is this is a fellowship offering. You've got to have enough meat for the priest and for your family, and of course something to offer up to God, right? Okay. So it could be a male or female, one of these animals, but in every case it had to be without blemish. The best you had to offer. Because remember, ultimately, the best part's going to go to God. And you want to honor him with the best of what you have. One exception to this with the free will, kind of spontaneous offering, it says in Leviticus 22, now, if you've got an animal that maybe has one limb slightly longer than the other, that's okay. It's like, oh, thanks. I'm just imagining this ancient Hebrew out there with a tape measure. But anyway. If you're a vegan, you're out of luck. Sorry. Okay. These are your choices on the menu. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the ritual itself. As with the other burnt offerings, the offerer places his right hand upon the head of the animal. There's this bond that is signified and created. Then the animal is killed there in the courtyard. Its blood is taken and very carefully collected and then dashed upon the sides of the bronze altar. Okay. That's done by the priest, of course. The offerer then is supposed to take the animal, now dead, and flay it and butcher it and clean it out, right? All that good stuff. They probably had some assistance there. The Levites, I think, would have helped with this task. But the idea is the worshiper has a hands-on role. Worship in ancient Israel was not a spectator sport, nor is it a spectator sport today, or at least it shouldn't be. Okay. And then the priest would take the fatty portions of the animal and burn them on the altar as an offering to the Lord. What are the fatty portions? It talks about them quite a bit. It talks about the kidneys, talks about the fatty lobe of the liver. Almost sounds like a class in animal anatomy. Heather, I think I need your help on this, right? And some other portions of the animal, kind of the visceral fat, I guess you would say. The organ fat, right? Those portions are taken out, and those are offered up to God. The rest of the animal would then be used for the consumption of the priest and then the worshipers. But why does God get these entrail portions? This sounds like something that British people would take and mince up and make a pie out of, or a pudding. What British people call pies and puddings, we would call an abomination unto the Lord. But but these are the parts that went to God. Yeah, Mark? It does. It's excellent.
I mean, I don't know why the spiritual significance, but from a practical significance, number one, it's not all that good for humans to eat.
Yeah.
Number two, it burns really well, so it would just like be more fully consumed.
Well, that's true. You know, if you've ever grilled a ribeye as opposed to a sirloin, you got to stay there with that ribeye because it's going to flare up on you. It's got all that good marbled fat, That fat just takes off, right? Certainly, it's ideal for burning. I think there's another idea present too. And next slide. So it does say all the fat belongs to the Lord. That's there in Leviticus 3:16. And the priest shall burn them on the altar as a food offering with a pleasing aroma. All fat is the Lord's. And I don't think this was because God was trying to keep the Israelites lean. I don't think this is for dietary reasons. I'll take the fat. You guys, just stick with the protein. Where's the flavor in the meat? A lot of times it's in that fat, right? Next slide here. So here are a couple of beautiful Wagyu 85 ribeye steaks. You guys familiar with Wagyu? It's like this. What's that? It's uber expensive. And you look at all the marbling, the veins of fat in that steak, and you'll see why it's so expensive. It just melts in your mouth, right? In ancient Israel, fat was regarded as the best, most flavorful portion of the meat. And so fat, in a way, again, there's a symbolism here. The idea is You're devoting the best to the Lord, okay? These were probably the pieces of meat that kids would have fought over. My brother and I used to fight over the fat. Seriously. That little piece of fat in the pork and beans, we would argue about who got that. Because, I mean, think about it. If you don't get the fat, you're not getting pork and beans, you're just getting beans, right? So my mom would take that little cube of fat and she would cut it in half so that my brother and I wouldn't argue about it. We were hopeless. Anyway. Also, fat is used elsewhere in the Bible in a metaphorical sense to refer to the best of something like the fat of the land and so forth. Living off the fat of the land. So, okay. So I think that's what's going on here. Right? It's highly combustible, so it's good for burning, and it also signifies, again, devoting the best to the Lord. And he always gets the first portion, right? So it's not like you eat and then whatever's left over you throw on the altar. No, the portion for God is offered up first. Then the priest gets his cut, and then the offerer and his family can have their fellowship meal. Next slide. There's one other verse here in this chapter I want to say a little bit about. So the fat belongs to the Lord. There's a prohibition on the consumption of fat. There's also a prohibition on the consumption of blood. And verse 17, Leviticus 3, it shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwelling places that you eat neither fat nor blood. Why would anybody want to consume blood? Well, again, if you're British, if you've ever had blood pudding, so. What's that? Well, yeah, there's a lot of iron and nutrients in the blood. I don't know. But not if you drink it. Yeah. And you know what? In some pagan rituals, that might have been a thing. Where people, consume blood. There's some evidence of that in the Old Testament. But blood was very sacred in the Hebrew understanding. The life of the animal, the nephesh of the animal, what's sometimes translated soul, the life force of the animal, was in the blood. Okay? And so you can go all the way back to Genesis chapter 9, right after the flood, and you'll see prohibitions about the consumption of blood. That an animal was not to be eaten with its lifeblood in it, because the life was in the blood. Okay? And so that's why there's this emphasis on draining the blood out of the animal, and but the blood was poured out there at the altar or used in other kinds of ritual ways. It was not for human consumption because the life is in it. Where does life come from? From God. God is the author of life. You're devoting back to God what is God's alone. Okay? He is the source of life. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, so there was a big debate in the early church about what do we do with these Gentiles coming into the fold? And so the apostles, the elders, and some others get together in Jerusalem. They have a big conference, and the decision is reached that, okay, we're not going to require circumcision of them. Okay, that's not part of the new covenant. But we are going to require a few basic things. So you do not eat meat sacrificed to idols. You do not eat animals that have been strangled with their lifeblood still in them, right? Or consume blood. It also mentions sexual immorality, because that was often a part of pagan worship as well as just the pagan lifestyle in general, okay? So it does look like that particular Noahic law, the prohibition of the consumption of blood, is was carried into the New Testament there. Yeah. So that's why I don't eat blood pudding. That I have no desire to. It's just like, I prefer chocolate pudding. Yes.
Town where we lived, and they slaughtered cattle. And the story goes that there was a guy that worked there in the slaughter room where they would hit an animal in the head to knock it out, tie a chain around its hind feet, and hoist it up. And then they would slit its throat to drain the blood. Well, there was one guy that had a cup, and he would catch a cup of that blood and drink it right there while it's still warm. I always wondered about that.
What was his name, Nosferatu? It's like the name of Dracula or the vampire, whatever. Yeah. Cow disease. Yeah, that's a real thing. I remember reading about that back when I was a kid, and I would read the Guinness Book of World Records because I had nothing better to do with my life, and it had a section on the world's rarest disease, and it was this disease among cannibals, where cannibals or some of these people groups like in Borneo or wherever would have. They called it. It had some other name for it. Some of you guys in the medical profession might remember it, but it was a disease brought on by eating the brain matter of human beings. And so somebody has a brilliant idea. Why don't we just to bulk these cows up? We'll just take ground up cow, including their brain, and we'll feed it back to the cows. Well, they get this kind of disease too, and then it gets carried over to humans and stuff. So I don't know. I don't know. Are you hungry for some head cheese? Is that what you're? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, as long as it's not contaminated, but I don't know how it works. It's beyond my medicine. Brain and eggs. I'll recommend that to Tim Stout when we have our next congregational breakfast. Brain and egg breakfast. What's that? Smart yolk. Yeah. I'll stick with spam. Okay. What's that? Nothing. All right, moving on. So, for those of you who just want to kind of see what the whole ritual looks like in detail, in summary, I should say, there you go. Male or female animal from the herd or the flock without defect. The priest, the offerer lays the hand on the animal. The priests take the blood, splash it against the sides of the altar. The fat goes to the Lord. There's also a grain offering involved with the fellowship meal, because man cannot live by meat alone, right? You gotta have some. If you're gonna have steak, you gotta have some nice bread to go with it. Okay, and then there's this big communal meal, and just don't eat the fat and the blood. Okay, next slide. Mentioned the bread that accompanies it. The details are there in Leviticus. Different kinds of loaves, unleavened and leavened. You can provide leaven for this. The leavened bread is not going on the altar. It was okay to bring the leavened bread as long as it was for human consumption, not to go on the altar to God. One loaf from each offering was given to the officiating priest, along with the right thigh of the animal. That was the priest's portion. Okay, and the animal's breast was also taken, but it was given to the priests in general. So even if you're not the officiating priest, if you're still there, attending the sanctuary, you and your family could share in that. You could have a meal as well. So, and there's the meat chart in case you have any questions about where those parts are located. All right. Let's go to the next slide. And just a reminder, I think I mentioned this earlier, this portion to the priest, I think, was God's way of teaching the people to provide for the needs of those who provide spiritual care for the community. And that's a principle that carries over into the New Testament as well. All right, so what's the relevance here for us? Next slide. Oh, I forgot this part. Yep, so just a little bit about the details of the meal. So the offerer and his family, they get to consume the meat and the bread, and they probably also had wine, a drink offering as well. In the courtyard or its vicinity had to be a clean place, okay? And what's going on here is this vertical fellowship with God and with each other. This is a fellowship sacrifice. There are some provisions about what to do with the leftovers. They didn't have refrigerators in those days. So in the case of a Thanksgiving offering, nothing was to be left over till the morning. If it was left over till the morning, it had to be burnt, okay? It wasn't to be consumed. There was an exception, though, for votive and free will offerings. You could keep the meat for a second day. After that, it had to be burned, okay? For ritual reasons and probably also hygienic reasons, right? The meat's going to spoil, okay? You're going to get food poisoning. You're going to get really sick eating rancid meat, okay? All right. Yes?
It's interesting that today, one of the delicacies in a steakhouse, in a high-class steakhouse, is to age the meat, hang it up and just let it get old. I don't know how old it can get, but it's supposed to tenderize.
Yeah. Yeah. But there's a specific process, way of doing that to ensure it doesn't go rancid. Yeah. Yeah. You have to trim it. Yeah. Yep. There's a channel on YouTube, Guga Foods. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It's this guy from Brazil. He's a bit of a character, and he's always doing these experiments with meat, like involving dry aging and stuff. He tried dry aging a steak one time in Nutella. I'm pretty sure there's a law in Leviticus against that. If there isn't, there should have been, because apparently it was just horrendous. I can't imagine why you would want to do that. But anyway, hey, it got 1 million views, so mission accomplished. All right, so okay, so what's the application here for us? Let's go to that next slide then. What do you see? What do you see as relevance for us? Or is this just some ancient arcane ritual that can teach us nothing as Christians today?
That we do each week from a non-believer's point of view, it's also silly.
Right.
It's foolishness to, non-believers, but to us, understanding the meaning, the reality, the spiritual reality of what we're doing, it's completely different. And that's why I think we're just so far removed from actually slaughtering our own animals. People 150 years ago would have related to this way better than we do. Because we live, we buy packaged meat at the store. Whereas they had to raise these animals and take care of them and, care for them and then bring them. I mean, it was a real sacrifice for them. They weren't not all blessed with superabundance, so to be giving your best animal to this was a big deal.
It's a major economic sacrifice, and as well, I think those kids too, Oh, we're gonna, offer up Daisy. Well, that's why we've been taking care of Daisy. I had a little cow named Daisy. My grandpa let us grandkids name the calves. And then I remember the night that my mom told us that we were having Daisy for supper. Daisy Helper. Yes.
There's a lot to learn. The easiest one is just fellowship, and we've learned about that through COVID. When you separate us, there's more depression. We need to fellowship with each other, but we're fellowshipping with family and with God and learning something from Him. And sometimes I wonder also, not making it really ritualistic, but like you said, there would be, hey, you bring something to God, and you're going to make a vow with Him, or devotion, or Thanksgiving, or things like that, where it's more important than just saying, yeah, I'll go do that. You're actually making an actual point. So sometimes I wonder if we do miss something by saying, oh, that's in the past. I think it's still important today.
Yeah. These are joyous occasions. These fellowship meals, they were not some kind of onerous drudgery that God imposed upon the people. This was, an avenue for intimacy with God, and that's what it looked like in their time. And I think there are principles of that that carry over to our time as well. Just to put the next slide up, I think about our fellowship meal, our fellowship sacrifice, right? Christ made the ultimate sacrifice for sin once and for all, but we share in the benefits of that. We share in the fellowship, the peace He made possible for us with God and with each other every time we gather. We're taking the bread and the cup, right? Okay. There's that vertical fellowship, communion with Christ, as well as communion with each other. Next slide, just summarizing that a little bit. Also, I'll just draw this to your attention as well. The portion that was placed upon the altar, remember, that was called the memorial portion. I think it's interesting that Christ says that when we gather, we do this in remembrance of Him. There's a memorial to the covenant. We're remembering what God has done for us, and in a way we're asking God to be faithful to remember His promises to us. Okay, it's picking up that sacrificial language from Leviticus. I think we might miss that if we don't have a grasp on the Old Testament backgrounds. Okay, this one could be done whenever, and so since it was for Thanksgiving or for a vow or for a free will offering, it wasn't like a compulsory daily thing. I suspect probably for most Israelites it was probably fairly rare, maybe once, twice a year, something like that, because it's expensive to take the best of your flock or herd and offer that up to God. Yeah.
It's the stopping from accumulating. You know,
Well,
it's to take the time out and to just be thankful, not to go gain anything else, but just to stop for a second.
yeah.
And that's why I just wondered how often they did that, because
Yeah, that's a good thought. I do think these sacrifices were powerful reminders that all of life is a gift from God, and not the result simply of our effort and ingenuity. God is the great provider, and we acknowledge that when we bring these offerings before Him. God always gets the best in the first portion, the first fruits, right? Because ultimately life is a gift from His hands.
yeah, it's because they're trying to feel a lot of self-sufficiency. I don't know if that was as much a struggle for them as maybe in our culture.
Well, there's some of that, Deuteronomy says when you get in the land and you get prosperous and successful, you're going to be tempted to think, aha, I did this. This is a way of saying no. God's the great provider. All right, we have 5 minutes left. I'm just going to briefly touch upon the next section because it's very important, and I want to try to make a little headway on it. So the next section, chapter 4 into chapter 5, purification offerings, also known as sin offerings here. The Hebrew expression is korban, word for gift, something brought near as a gift to God. Korban chatat. That's a hard one to say, chatat. That's the word often translated sin. So usually you'll see in most translations this referred to as a sin offering, okay? That's the traditional translation. But I do think there's a problem with the traditional translation. Let me explain the next slide. That verb, chata, often does mean to sin, okay? But it's also used in ritual contexts as purification, as to mean like to purge, or to cleanse, to de-sin, we might say. Somebody's not a fan of the sin offering. Okay. And I give a bunch of scriptures there, and you'll look through there and you'll see, I don't see anything about sin offering or sin. I just see the word cleanse and purify. And it's that same word. That's how it's being translated in those ritual contexts. I'll give an example here from Psalm 51, verse 9. Purge me with hyssop. I will be clean. Wash me and I will be whiter than snow. That word purge, it's the word for sin. It's that chata. And so a lot of scholars think, maybe a better translation here is a purification offering. Next slide. Because if you look at how these offerings function, usually it's not to deal with sin as we think of sin as Christians today. These are offerings to purge the effects of unintentional sin, often offenses of a ritual character, okay? So let's say you're just walking down the street one day and you happen to see Fred. Hey, Fred, how you doing? You give Fred a big hug and you move on. And Fred's like, oh, George, but before you can hear Fred call for you, you're on your way to the market. Well, later that day, you find out that Fred was on his way to see the priest. And lo and behold, it looks like old Fred has leprosy. And you just went about the rest of your day doing all kinds of stuff in a state of ritual impurity. What are you going to do about that? Oops. You're going to go to the tabernacle. You're going to offer one of these purification offerings. It's not because you've sinned in any deliberate sense. You unintentionally contacted an impurity and didn't deal with it out of ignorance, okay? That's the kind of stuff, for the most part, we're dealing with here, with a few exceptions. That and serious forms of ritual impurity that require some kind of purification on the 8th day. So if it goes beyond a week, there's usually like a sacrifice involved, one of these purification offerings. So, for example, a woman who's given birth. When the time of her impurity is over, she makes a purification offering. Well, how is giving birth to a child sin? It's not. But it renders a person ritually unclean for a set period of time. The same with a person with leprosy, right? Once they've been cleansed, they offer one of these purification offerings, sin offerings. Same with a person with some kind of a continuing genital discharge. I'll do a whole lesson about that. So I think one can make a case that it's probably better, given how these offerings function, to simply call them purification offerings, whether it's for unintentional sin or for some kind of serious impurity, right? They enable a person to have access once again to sacred space and other aspects of life. What about intentional sins? Next slide. What about blatantly defying God's covenant? blaspheming the name of the Lord, breaking the Sabbath, and not because you don't know better, but because you do, right? What if you murder someone or cheat on your spouse? Well, I guess I better get a goat and go down to the temple. No. Next slide. We're going to end with this. In Levitical law, there is no purification or sin offering for individuals guilty of such sins. The book of Numbers explains, Numbers 15, verses 30 through 31, but the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he is native or a sojourner, reviles the Lord. In other words, blatant acts of covenant defiance, right? That person shall be cut off from among the people. You don't offer an animal's life in ransom for yours or to expurge or to cleanse your record, okay? You pay with your own life. You must be, the community must be purified by your expulsion or death, okay? Because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment, that person shall be utterly cut off, his iniquity shall be on him. And a lot of people hear this and like, oh man, what about sins today? What about the horrible things we've done? Friends, we have a better sacrifice. We have a once-for-all sacrifice for the sins of the world. We're not under this system anymore, okay? God was training his people and preparing them for the coming of the ultimate sacrifice. We'll talk a little bit next week about maybe some exceptions, some intentional sins that could be, where the sentence could be commuted, some kind of atonable offense. But we've covered enough today. All right. Are you loving Leviticus yet? I find it interesting. I hope you're learning something. God bless you all.